Let's start today talking about the 1923 BYU football program. Now, we talked about BYU's 1922 season, a pretty paltry output, just 10 points scored in 1922. Well, the hope going into 1923 was improvement under Coach Twitchell, Alvin Twitchell, BYU's first ever football coach. And BYU, by and large, got improvement, obviously, on the gridiron in 1923, but it did not go all that well overall for the Cougars. On the season, we won't bury the lead here. They ended up going 2-5 on the season, second to last in the Rocky Mountain Conference. The only team worse than them were the Wyoming Cowboys, who BYU did not play that season, who went 0 on the year. BYU ended up, as I mentioned, 2-5 and made some history in 1923 that they had not done in 1922. They played their first ever non-conference matchup against Western State out of Colorado. BYU was one of the 2 wins on the year, shutting out the Western State Teachers, if I'm not mistaken, 19-0. That was a game in early November. Now, the interesting part about football schedules in this era of college football, my friends, is yesterday we talked about BYU playing 6 games in the 1922 season. They played 7 games in 1923. Their first game came September 29th, and then they didn't finish up the season until November 29th. They played just 7 games. They had quite a few gaps in this. In fact, BYU's first game against Montana State was followed by a 2-week gap before they faced off against Colorado Agricultural. You know, it's Colorado State today. And then followed that up two straight weeks with games against Colorado and Utah. So kind of an interesting way the dichotomy of the schedule worked out. But BYU got their first win of the season in their season opener. They welcomed Montana State for the first time to Provo and beat the Bobcats 16-15 at BYU. Now, the interesting part about this game was that a future head coach for BYU was on the opposing sideline. Some of you may know the name Ott Romney, a guy who ended up coaching BYU football as well as BYU basketball in the late 20s to the mid 30s. He was the head coach of the Montana State Bobcats and obviously brought his Bobcats to Provo and lost that game. Now, he got the last laugh in a way because they ended up going 5-4 on the season, speaking of Montana State, so finishing higher than BYU in the standings. But then BYU, as I mentioned, had a break, and the issues BYU faced in 1922 resurfaced to a large degree, particularly on offense. Now, the Cougars went to Colorado State, or what was Colorado Agricultural in Fort Collins, Colorado, lost that game 14-6, which was a bit of a surprise because Colorado State or Colorado Agricultural was expected to run roughshod over BYU. Well, BYU got beat up in that game, and then the following week they went to Colorado and faced off against a very powerful Buffalo squad in Boulder. Well, Colorado did something that was very atypical of the 1920s in college football of that era. They threw the ball down the field, and if you read the stories about BYU in this game, Colorado was intent on just throwing the ball all over the yard, kind of a foreshadowing to 50-some-odd years later when BYU would be known so heavily for just throwing the ball all over the field. But Colorado did that to BYU. The other thing is Colorado took advantage of a very, very banged up BYU team in this game, and BYU kind of limped home with a 41-0 loss to the Colorado Buffaloes. Those back-to-back road games out there in Colorado did not treat BYU well. So BYU returned home for their annual rivalry matchup against Utah. Now, reading about this Utah game, we talked yesterday about the pettiness that Utah State and Utah had for the Cougars by denying them the opportunity as debutantes in the Rocky Mountain Conference to not be able to use freshmen, unlike other newcomers to the conference. So call it what you will, but that's a rivalry tactic and obviously something that is meant to keep, quote-unquote, little brother down as long as possible. Well, in this game against Utah, BYU was considered by many to be a heavy, heavy underdog to the Utes, but BYU surprised many. Despite not scoring, they ended up limiting Utah in Provo to just 15 points. That was a thing that most of the stories talked about, that Utah, some thought they would score 30 or 40 on BYU, but the Cougars defense came to the forefront in this game. Now, overall in the season, BYU had moments of pretty good play on defense. There was an improvement on that side of the football, but the offense remained just an absolute joke for the Cougars, frankly. On the season, BYU scored a grand total of 46 points. So an improvement improvement over the 10 points from the previous year, but they still gave up so many points once again. But going back to that Utah game just for a moment, as I was reading up on this, I did not notice this before, but did you guys know that in 1923, there was an incident in the BYU Utah game in which Lee Richards from the University of Utah was alleged to have bitten a BYU football player? Yes, you heard that right. They called him Swenson. I've got to look up his name here, but he was playing for BYU. Let me pull this up while I'm doing this. That was oh man, if I can find this here, give me a minute. Oh, Reed Swenson, excuse me. So you called him Swede. BYU had nicknames all over the roster for all of these guys on the football roster at the time. But in this game, he was called out by an article by BYU about biting Swede Swenson in the middle of the game. You can't tell me that this is a rivalry that's just meant to be. Remember, going back to the 1890s, the first game ever between the Utes and the Cougars was a baseball game that ended in a brawl. Folks, the BYU-Utah rivalry, we talk sometimes about it being too hot-headed, too toxic. Remember that with Larry Kay almost a century later. But here's the thing. It's always been a rivalry. It's always been heated, and it's always had some incredible moments. But Lee Richards ended up biting Swede Swenson in this game. And then BYU, let me see if I can find the actual story here. Yeah, there was a poem written about it. I won't read the entire thing because it's quite long, but it says this: in 1923 comes a football fight for victory. Two colleges rivals meet on the football field, each roving their ground they'll never yield. There the keenness of the contest, battles in war, and the men who fought as never they fought before. They were warriors worth battling nobly and well, but the thing that the spectators never could tell was whether friend Richards, the Utah man, fights or whether he's canine, and whether he's canine and fighting, he bites. You know, it's a pretty good deal. And obviously a little bit of a jab his way as he got outed for biting an opposing player. You know what? This is fun to look back and learn some of these things, because I would have never been able to tell you in 1923 that a Utah player in a win over BYU, by the way, the Utes now 2-0 over the Cougars, would bite a BYU player. But alas, that is exactly what happened. And the rest of the season played out with BYU once again winning their first ever non-conference game against Western State, 19-0, and then finishing out the season in pretty ignominious fashion, losing at Utah State 40-0, and then going to Colorado College in Colorado Springs, Colorado, and losing 31-6. That brings the grand total of BYU to 2 wins against 5 losses. And overall, a bit of a move in the right direction for BYU. Better offense, some better defense overall for the team. And you know what? One bite mark that will be left indelibly in the history books for BYU and the Utah rivalry. It is, I'm telling you, these are going to be some fun things to look back on. The first 50 years of BYU football, I'll be very, very clear once again. There's going to be a lot of down moments for BYU. They didn't have a lot of breakthroughs, but once we start moving along here, there's always storylines, and we'll talk about 1924 tomorrow with Alvin Twitchell in his 3rd season for the Cougars and how things went in that regard. An improvement is kind of the story of the thing for BYU in these early years. It's football that many of us would not recognize. 1920s college football is a far cry from what we experience here in the 2020s, but alas, it's fun to learn about our history. Speaking of BYU, where they were and now where they're at today. And the only way we can do that is by going back season by season and looking back at all these things that we learned. So if you learned anything from this today, just remember BYU and Utah, that rivalry has existed forever. And this edition in 1923 featured the chomp, as it were, as a Utah player took a piece or attempted to take a piece out of a BYU Cougar, quite literally.